I think we can share the timer and then also start with the debate. All the best, everybody. Inviting the Prime Minister to open the case inside OG here.
Yeah, just give me a minute. Just give me half a minute and I'll give you. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the motion in front of us is that this House believes that a proportion of tax collected from every individual should be donated by the state to prominent independent environmental organization. Now, how does the government understand a proportion of tax collected to mean, right? And especially when the matter is from every individual. What the government's understanding is that every state, as we would define later, would take a percentage of its total tax revenue and then forward it to different prominent independent environmental organizations. Okay, whatever its tax revenue is, instead of imposing additional percentage of burden on every individual, right? Now, how do we understand state to mean here, right? State refers to different countries, mostly countries like USA, India, Canada, even China, giving higher prominence to one that have historically been contributors of climate change, right? Now, to more, the more important definition of what is meant by prominent and independent. Okay, these are two different aspects of environmental organization that we're covering. So, prominent means organizations that are already established, already have taken measures, and already have achieved a lot of things in the problem and on the issues of environmental change, or just generally environmental preservation in a society, right? So we're not talking about providing funds to any environmental organization, right? There's an element of credibility that has been provided by the motion itself, right? Then we come to independent, right? When we talk about independent, what we essentially mean is that there's no overarching corporate or state control or interference in the working of this organization. That is not to say it is arbitrary. It has internal structures that ensure that its work is still focused on something. Okay, there's just no arbitrary control over something else, right? So what is I'll proceed with defining the burden and then establishing the framework a little bit more, right? The burden on side government is to show that all stakeholders in our paradigm are better off, right? And what is the paradigm is that the proportion of tax revenue is given to environmental organizations, right? Instead of being kept with the state, right? Now it's a good point to just define who are exactly our stakeholders, right? Our stakeholders are the most vulnerable and the most important ones are being people that are actually impacted by this climate change, right? Second, it's the very nature itself. By its extension, every human being, different species, uh, different animals, so to say, right? And a third and fourth stakeholder is the environmental organizations and the government itself, right? And we will deliberate on how the position of every single stakeholder is better off in our paradigm as compared to the oppositions. Now, just to put a little bit of more frameworking, right? How does the status quo work, right? In our status quo, we have a system of progressive taxation in most countries, right? And so what is meant by that? It is to say that every single person who is relatively poorer or have less access to financial resources are giving less tax compared to someone who is well disposed or richer, right? So opposition cannot come here and say that such imposition of such a tax system would unnecessarily burden people who are vulnerable, because we already have progressive taxation in place which is already being imposed, and we're already only taking a percentage of this and furthering it, in the endeavor of environmental change through the means of environmental organizations, right? And now we also, one more contextualization or framework to say that I want to establish is that environment change is very important, right? It is an immediate need of a society, whether we talk about islands in Maldives drowning, or people, having to be rehabilitated, or we talk about Australian forest fires. The stakeholders are being very immediately affected and their everyday lives are being thrown around, right? And that's why it's a very immediate issues that needs to be tackled. Now, I would like to here present my first alternative, right? Our first alternative is first argument is my bad. The first argument is that why are we preferring independent organizations specifically over state, right? Environmental, why is that state has to transfer these funds to independent or environmental organization? Why can they not do this themselves? Okay, for that I prefer three sub arguments. Now, first of all, we have to understand that every state has a certain policy regulatory gap, because how the legislative system is built in most countries, there's a lot of regulatory gap in passing any policy, right? It goes through a lot of stages. Take the example of India, it has to pass the Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha, get sanctioned by the police, get sanctioned by the president. That just takes a lot of time, which we cannot have when the problem is as imminent as environmental change, right? That is why we need an independent organization that has the power to do it quickly. Second sub argument is that the probability of self-interest is very low. The agents that work with these independent environmental organizations are very less likely to have self-interest, because first of all, these independent environmental organizations do not reap big profits in the first place, right? As opposed to a statesman who has a lot of advantages of just being him. So that is why the government believes that the individuals that work in independent organizations are more likely to be efficient. They're more likely to be passionate about furthering their goal of solving the problem of climate change. I'll take the POI.
Yeah, why is it legitimate for no state oversee organizations to be paid through tax money?
Well, okay. First of all, you have to understand for this. Now, this is the one constructive that my DPM will cover when they'll explain why individuals in such totality should be taxed, right? And how they have such a duty to do that, and how that benefits them. And otherwise, you have to understand that just to sum it up, that individuals are stakeholders in climate change, and they are being benefited from any kind of endeavor that solves the problem of climate change, right? And that's why we believe that on principled grounds, it is justified to use tax money to solve these grounds through independent legal organization, right? Now, coming to my third sub argument of why independent organizations are better than state, right? And this is because of specialization and experts. These independent environmental organizations like Greenpeace or WWF, they are much likely to have specialized experts that are very focused on the idea of solving these problems, right? And solving these very specific problems all around the world. This is something that the government does not always have access to. And even if they do, even if they create expert panels or anything like that, the level of specialization by individual states can never reach one that would be possessed by such organization, right? To sum it up, we have contextualized the debate, shown how the government needs to show is that how stakeholders in our paradigm is better when the state transfers such funds to independent environmental organizations. Now, what we expect from opposition is a comprehensive explanation of how environmental change and these stakeholders would be better off if such funds are either used by state or not further transferred to environmental organizations. Thank you. Proud to propose.
Thanks a lot for that speech. I now invite leader in opposition to open their case, also requesting all the participants to keep their speeches within the time limit. Thank you so much. Yes, over to the LO now.
Sorry, just one more clarification. Could I please know which house raised the POI? It was raised by KS Arartik. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, CEO, I think.
Hi, I'm Ishita, preferred pronoun she and her. I'll go as the leader of opposition. I'll take my POI after the 5th minute, preferably from the closing half. I'll begin in 10 seconds. Assuming I'm completely audible, I just set my timer. Also, like before beginning, if I don't take a POI, like till 5:30, feel free to unmute yourself. Only the closing, right? Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is how I'm going to structure my speech. First, I'm going to tell you the optics of this debate. Second, like I'm going to justify why these funds are better off on our paradigm. Thirdly, deal with some kinds of points from opposition, like the harms in government's paradigm, basically. Beginning with the optics of this debate, right? Understand what this motion necessarily look like when you're giving taxpayers money to these organizations, right? State has given up on legislation and believes that true meaningful change can only come by giving money to these independent organizations, right? A total failure of state as in, right? Now coming to the most important thing, like legitimacy of this movement, right? The basic point to understand over here is that it is optional for these organizations to tell whether to show how they're using these funds. The fact that government comes here and tells you that these are prominent organizations means these are credible is justified to a certain extent, but the credibility of government to a people is much higher, right? Government is answerable to the people. You have to vote for them in the next elections. There is an electoral incentive that goes on, right? That is to say, government cannot come up and, like, let's say, use the money in any kind of way, right? The certain accountability exists because you have this, let's say, this electoral procedure of voting, etc., which is not present for these organizations, right? The fact that their legitimacy will be very less, right? Secondly, dealing with the idea of accountability, right? Why is tax collected from the people in the first place? Taxes are collected for structural development of nation, to generate income for undertaking projects, to boost the economy of the country, right? To raise the standard of living, right? Taxes, what we propose is a very interesting counterfactual, right? We tell to you that a part of this tax should be, let's say, used by the government to fight the climate change directly. That is to say, rather than government using this tax, giving this tax to an independent organization, they use especially this part of tax to, let's say, bring out policy changes in the country itself, to bring out, let's say, climate changes in the first place, right? I have to answer this. Just please stop the timer for a second. I'm really sorry. I'll begin in just a second. I think, yeah, counterfactual, right? I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, talking about the counterfactual, what necessarily looks like is that we are taking this money that we are collecting from the people, and the government is using this money to bring out climate change policies, etc., in the parliament itself, right? What a government tell to you that why are we preferring them? Because there is a regulatory gap, Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha. Look at the kind of incentive mechanism where we are creating in a counterfactual, when we are forcing the government, and we are actually telling the government to use this money to, let's say, try to bring on climate change policies. We are actually trying to bring grassroots impact, right? When you are using that taxpayers money to, let's say, impact climate change policies, or let's say install these bridges, or let's say use do not use gases like CNG, etc. You're trying to bring on grassroots impact to a certain extent, right? Now, what understand that if their end goal on side of government and side opposition, it's to, let's say, see where is this let's say, where you are fighting climate change in the best way possible. On our side, we tell to you that we are incentivizing the government when they are using this taxpayers money themselves to bring on societal change, to bring on change for policy change for climate change itself. The change will be much better off, right? Understand. Secondly, their idea was that the probability of the self-interest of these groups is very limited, and then they give you the example of Greenpeace also, how they have specialized focus, etc. Look at the need of these organizations, right? These organizations have a need, that is to say, they have to advertise themselves to say, let's say, relevant in the first place in these countries, right? They have to do some kinds of advertising to stay relevant in the first place. Talking about Greenpeace, understand Greenpeace is an organization that is actually present in, let's say, 50 countries. That is, they have an international presence. When these communities have an international presence, they have the capacity to raise money and social capital on their own. That is to say, they do not have a need to, let's say, get money from the government itself. So the incentive for these organizations to get money from the government itself is limited to a very high extent, right? These are prominent organizations, independent organizations. Most of these organizations do tend to stay away from political parties and government because they don't want to get influenced by, because look at the kind of influence these things will have, right? Now it is on the onus of the government also, like which kinds of organizations they are funding, right? There are multiple independent multiple independent environmental organizations exist. Now you're giving the choice of, let's say, funding these organizations to the government. Political incentives also act like government is also going to choose, like, let's prefer this one organization over the other, right? That is to say that these organizations becoming political in the future is also something that is actually going to happen in government, and the government has to define why it is not going to happen. Talking about these organizations not having the incentive to, let's say, go on the first place and ask government for funds because they are prominent, they can use money, they have that kind of social capital already, right? Secondly, on the idea about incentive of government to give also to these organizations is limited, because why should government rather government would prioritize, it's 540 POI from the closing. Okay, it's 515, yeah, POI from the closing anyways. 3, 2, 1. Notice the lack of engagement, panel. Then coming to our case, right? What we tell to you few things, right? Number one, we tell to you about the legitimacy and the choice for them to display where they are using money will be very, very limited, right? Secondly, we tell about accountability, how the accountability from government side will be higher because government has an electoral incentive, etc., and they need to come into the next election, so they probably have a much better accountability. Answerability to the government or to the people is very, very low on their side, because these organizations have charities and enough social capital to raise money, etc. Fourthly, we tell to you how we suggest our counterfactual, how you should use this money to fight climate change and bring on policy changes itself. And this is actually how we are going to have grassroots development on our paradigm, actually the way to fight climate change, right? How government can target, let's say, effective waste production, sustainable management by using this kind of money. We tell to you how these organizations are basically international, like Greenpeace itself, and that is why they have a lot of prominence and influence, and we do not want them to, let's say, they have that kind of prominence, and that is why their answerability is limited to a certain extent. And the fact that they do not also have the incentive to, let's say, be connected to political figures, because it is also damaging for their own face as well, because because people will think that this organization is taking money from the government, so this organization will be biased, etc., just challenging their own credibility into the first place, right? On thirdly, impact, even if we think that these organizations also need money, etc., etc., on a comparative, we think that our side is much better when you are separating both of them and you're not having the influence of governmental. And lastly, we tell to you how, looking at the optics of this motion itself, it is simple to understand that it is basically a state failure when state has to look for outside organizations when they can't bring on anything by themselves. If they are trying to create meaningful change, they are actually looking for external organization rather than changing their own policies, proud to oppose.
Great. Thanks a lot for that speech. I now invite Deputy on Government to extend their case here. Also, actually, just before that, Kevin, I think like you got disconnected. So is that okay, or do you want to reconnect or something?
My Wi-Fi was acting up in between, but I think it's fine now. Like I can hear everyone clearly.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we didn't stop the debate because I think you came back after a couple of seconds, but just in case if you want us to stop this.
Yeah, I'll drop in a text maybe on Discord or something if I'm out for too long. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, Deputy Prime Minister, whenever.
Just give me 5 seconds. Okay, starting in, so my POI preference is please raise your hand through the reactions, and I will take it around the 5th minute. Please do not interrupt my speech, and do not spam the chat. If I don't take it around the 5th minute, then please write it in the chat. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, today my speech will look like this. I will first give you some quick rebuttals against the opposition. Then I will move on. Then I'll move on to the extension of my PM's case, and then I will explain to you I'll give you another constructive, and then I'll explain to you I will explain to you how the best case scenario of the opposition is still worse off than our worst case scenario. Okay, so coming on to what the opposition has stated in their speech. So they talked about how the state should be responsible for utilizing these taxes in a manner in a manner to fight climate change and protect the environment, etc., and how they are accountable to the people, and that will help them to actually take proper steps, right? Okay, so this is a very utopic idea of what governments are. So governments are essentially corrupt. Like the corruption that is prevalent in governments all over the world is very prevalent, and there is much less transparency than there will be an independent environmental organization. They kept on harping on how these independent environmental organizations will be politicized by the government. Okay, so now let's think about what the motives of the government are here. If motive of the government is actually to be transparent and to make sure that their image in the public is very good as proposed by the opposition, then why would governments try to sway these independent organizations into their favor? And even if they politicize it, even if in the worst case scenario they politicize it, if the end goal is still for them to reach environmental protection, then how is that a bad thing? That is actually serving the motive, that is the motive of these independent organizations there. Like how they have essentially contradicted themselves by saying that government can politicize these institutions, but governments are a very accountable and answerable entity. So now coming on to an extension, we will state the government will provide that the state will give checks and balances, legal checks and balances. They will provide legal checks and balances because they furthering on to the point of opposition, if they want to be answerable to the people, they will put in place several checks and balances. And on why the state will essentially delegate this responsibility to independent organizations is so that they can focus on other important issues. Like my PM came here and said these independent organizations are much more expert in these areas also, so that and the state here can focus on much different issues like welfare and infrastructure and etc., poverty and all. Basically the cost and burden on the state will reduce. Now coming on to the next rebuttal, they said that there will be grassroots change when the state will take on this responsibility. Let us explain this to opposition. There is not one individual independent organization that is working on this movement. There will be several independent environmental organizations that will be allocated these funds, and these independent organizations will work on grassroots. On what basis are you saying that they won't take grassroots action? Third of all, they said Greenpeace can like in international institutions, the Greenpeace can find their own funds. We did not use that example to show source of funds. We only use that example to show how these organizations are more transparent than government. Coming on to a third argument, why every individual should be taxed. So first of all, let's think about the current structure of taxation. In these times, rich people are often not taxed, right? Because the very, very rich are often not taxed. So when you put a blanket ban on all individuals being taxed, these rich people will be taxed. These rich people will come into this base, and these are the people who are the base. Like these people are these industrialists, these big shots in the industries. These are the reasons that often the climate change, like problem with climate change, take place in the first place. I will take the POI right now.
Can you substantiate on your working assumption that these organizations are inherently more transparent because they are working out of quote unquote passion?
Okay, I'll take that in the last. So now coming back to why every individual should be taxed. So we said that, so these individuals, if all the individuals are taxed, then there will be a sense of responsibility, or a sense of, okay, my money is going here, there is a very important issue, this issue needs to be addressed. And that is why they will become much more cognizant of the problem. They will take preventive measures so that these don't happen in the first place. So like, if you, the next time you are throwing out littering on the road, you, for the one thing that will come to your mind will be like, okay, my money is going in this place, my money is being taxed for this purpose, maybe I should not do it in the first place, right? Why make my own job harder, coming to, which is which is come on, very human tendency, right? Second, third of all, we in here we state that they can also propose a paradigm where, in the current status quo, what happens is that only rich people, the people that contribute to these institutions are either they do it in bulk, or they do it like rich people, they do it as a sense of, showcasing their, love for environment, or like even as potential, even as genuine. It's in very small instances, it's in lump sums, but in very small instances and periods of spaces, right? This will eradicate the problem of scarcity of funds. Now coming on to what the POI asked was, how independent environmental organizations are more transparent. Okay, so first of all, these organizations are formed on the basis of people who want to work towards this area. Who else would come into these organizations, would spend time here, would spend resources here, their own time here, other than not to benefit the environment? Of course, there are anomalies, but we're talking about majority of the people who are working here. Second of all, there is very less profit in these areas, right? Because if you're working in environmental organizations, the profit here would be very less. So if they're doing it on less profits, there is very good chance that they're doing it because they want to actually make it better. But as opposed to people who are working in the government, they were working in the state. If state does it, then these individual peoples can have their own self-interest and can redirect these tax into their own personal criteria. This is why we say that the CEO will come, that the CG will come here, and they will give only extensions of our environment, and why the OO's case is fallacious in its own sense. Thank you. Proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. I again please members keep your speeches to the stipulated time limit. Inviting Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case here.
Yeah, Dhruv Jan, he/him will take POIs via chat. We'll call out for one around 5th minute. Please do not unmute yourself. And I will begin my speech in 10 to 15 seconds. All right, can someone confirm if I am audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. So I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel, this is how I'm going to structure my debate. First of all, challenging the very superficial case of the opposition side, and then giving you what we as opening opposition brought to the table. All right. First of all, opposition talked about how states should be responsible for utilizing these resources, how they are accountable to people, and they call it a utopic idea. They comes and say that there is corruption. Rather hilarious panel. Independent being affected by other independent organizations. First of all, the word independent means that they are not bound to answer to government or any other people whose taxes are being used to for the benefit of this environmental changes. They are not answerable to people directly, whereas on the other side government has electoral politics, which was finally substantiated by the first speaker, how this as an incentive, a far better incentive to provide accountability to the people. Next, they say that government will keep checks and balances on these independent organizations, but try to understand panel. They first of all didn't give any analysis that how these checks and balances will look like. So just an assertion that they will come up and be able to control the functioning of these prominent organization is this is not something that we can buy. These independent organizations will have expertise people again affected by other countries. Until what did we have to depend on these organizations? Instead, it is better for the government to invest in own resources. Now what will happen if we are completely dependent on these organizations for environmental changes? These organization being affected by the western countries also, because they need funding for advertisement. Again substantiated by the first speaker that a whole amount of this whole amount of this money will go into advertisement and telling people what they are doing to again get this. So this again will be problematic because self dependency of the government will be very less. And considering the status quo, considering the status quo, that Atmanirbhar sort of part that we want to achieve will be left in vain. Next, they tell that mechanisms of taxes, that rich do not pay taxes or poor are taxed. I'm unsure what they wanted to tell you by saying this, because taxing mechanism is same, only government is giving away a proportion of money. All right. Next, they say that self interest of these organizations will not exist, but I don't know how. Because self interest of these organizations do exist. They have to survive. Their self benefit is a complete this is a complete assertion from them. They said that it's much less probable since they are good Samaritans. This is literally a squirrel away from the international presence. Firstly, they can raise money by strong arm by bigger nations to focus those funds elsewhere. So that's another self-interest metric panel, as they want larger funding from big powers like USA. If the USA has oil fields in Philippines and Filipino government gives an organization a cutout of Vahan, cutout from the people, from their people, the tax of US will be stronger, and that organization, just so it ignores the oil field practices in the Philippines. All right, dealt with the opposition government's case. Now moving on, what we provide to you, we tell you. Uh, just a second. Yeah, we tell you how this independent uh, independent will be far worse off than the state battle state organization. We tell you how what is the optics of the debate, that when we are giving this money to this independent organization, it will be considered as a failure of state, as they can't do these things for the welfare of the people on their own. We tell you what is the main counterfactual on our side. We want the government to take part themselves. Part of these taxes should be used directly instead of giving away the incentive. This will bring about incentive of policy change. That is our end goal, because when policies changes, better policies come in place, and this will result in betterment of environmental as well as the main stakeholders, that are people people living in that particular area. They then also the challenge is that there will be regulatory gap when policies are passed on panel. This is what our benefit is. Try to understand that when there is some time taken to form some policies, there is better discourse, there is chances of better discourse, instead of these organization of these independent organizations just giving away orders to just taking any arbitrary decisions to spend their money. Instead, a proper discourse where to use the hard-earned money of the people is taking place, and hence the utilization of taxes is far better in our place. We tell you what is the legitimacy, why it is legitimate, that choice for them to display where they use money, etc. These international organizations are not legitimate, because since they are independent, it is very it is not it is we can't come up, and they are not accountable to the people or the government independently. And also, since we are directly depending on them, they will try to influence the policies also that are in favor, and the funding that are being given to them in the near future. Like they can come up and say, like, we are not being provided with enough resources, now we can't do anything for the environment. This is not how it works. All right, they can sit tight and do nothing and pretend on social media that we are doing this, we are doing that. Such a tokenistic way the government want to bring that, still get attraction enough to be bashed by the society. All right, moving forward to POI. If closing first, 3, 2, 1. All right, OG.
How can you say that a regulatory gap of what is 3 to 4 years is beneficial when it is stopping relief reach those people that are being affected at this moment?
All right. It is far better off to invest these resources by taking some time. If these resources are just being scattered away with no useful benefit. All right. And next, these organizations are independent because they are not dependent on, let's say, political parties for money and raise that by cheers instead of provides credibility. They will lose this tag of being independent if they become answerable to any particular government. Again, providing you what the counterfactual that we brought was had a major impact, because a part of this tax will be used by the government only to fight the climate change. So it will be clearly visible where the government is being used. Again, electoral politics exist. Understand, when we propose this, the propensity of government changing policies also increases to a very high level. Policy change should be the end goal. Only way we can expect some good shit to happen. Next, moving on, the reach of these independent organizations will be very less as compared to the government, because these independent organizations are looking forward for many different countries, and government only has only one country to focus and on its people to invest their resources. And hence we tell you how our counterfactual will be better, how the utilization of hard-earned resources will be better on our side. And it's very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, this marks the end of the first half of the debate. I now invite member on CT to open their keys. Here.
Thank you very much. My name is Farva Nadim. I will be going as a member of government, and I will try my best to take a POI in the 5th minute, as long as I am done with my content. So I will begin in, just give me a second. Let me put the timer for myself as well. Okay. All right. So 3, 2, 1, go. All right. A very good afternoon to the House at large. The closing government will be providing a more extensive and a more comprehensive approach to this entire case. But let's begin with another form of characterization to this debate. We would like to mention and talk about the general carbon footprint and the greenhouse emissions and the impact of these on nations and the world as a whole, and why it is directly related to this particular case, and how taxing individuals is actually an incredible idea to directly tackle with the entire case. So, as we already know, the largest contributors to carbon footprint in the entire world are countries like the USA, China, Russia, Germany, as well as India. And governments all over the world are struggling to pass environmental laws because big corporation lobbies either don't allow the proper policies to be implemented, or the legislation takes way too much time and there are too many contentions about the same. So there have already been many climate conventions, such as the Kyoto Protocol, the UN Climate Change Conventions in Bonn or Warsaw or Doha, etc. But they haven't provided a lot of fruitful benefits or a lot of fruitful results, which is why this is the next most plausible scenario and solution for the same. So we already, and talking about corporations and how they don't allow these proper policies to be implemented, we already know that a lot of them often evade environmental laws and specifically work towards their capitalistic and financial gains, which is why we think that it is important to involve the general public in this entire case. And that is why, and that is where I will be talking about our major stakeholders and their problems. So we already have established that it is the whole world and people from every single nation, which is not just the rich or the privileged, but also or the relatively better off, but also those who are particularly close to the poverty line and are more subjected to these issues. So we're talking about groups of people from lower economic backgrounds who do not have access to clean drinking water or who cannot afford to combat these issues on an individual level. And we would also like to bring into light indigenous communities all around the world whose cultures and traditions place a huge emphasis on land and are directly affected by issues such as deforestation and logging. So moving on to, now that we've established this, let's move on to the constructives that we have, and we will do this with a very comprehensive form of analysis. So let's talk about why taxes are used or what taxes are used for in the first place, which are basically public utilities. And the biggest public utility that a nation has is the environment. So why is it necessary to tax these people? This is because the people and the state have an equal responsibility towards the environment, which basically means that the effect of this is twofold, and this will include the accountability of both parties. Meaning that when people know that their money is going towards a particular cause, they are much more likely to hold the government accountable if they don't see it being used effectively. Basically pointing to the fact that the public becomes an active stakeholder. Now, people are already stakeholders and directly involved in this issue, even if they aren't active, which basically means that they're directly affected by it, which we already know. And let's take the example of Greta Thunberg, who has not just moved people and states, but also major corporations, and has created a feedback loop for them to be more environmentally conscious and abide by the laws that they're already meant to follow in the first place. Now, moving on to the next, which is how will this entire situation help the issue? It will help us combat climate change, global warming, water pollution, deforestation, logging, and help improve the condition of the marine life, which are major environmental issues. Now, moving on to the importance of these particular independent organizations, we have already established that they are prominent and non-governmental organizations, meaning that they are accountable to the cause and to the people because they are not working under the direct rule of the government, basically meaning that they are not embroiled in the politics that goes behind it, and therefore they work independently. Also, it creates a sort of safety net in nations whose governments don't believe in climate change, such as the administration of former US President Trump, who did not necessarily believe in climate change, even regardless of the amount of proof there. So basically, by taxing these individuals, we would be able to basically create a safety net wherein even if government organizations aren't actively working towards the cause, the taxes that are collected are helping in this entire issue. Now, let's remember that these taxes aren't given to a single party, but whole lobbies that are working against major environmental issues, such as the Global Footprint Network or the World Wildlife Fund. Now, let us remind the House that taxes are already taken from the public and they're already used for various causes, such as but not limited to the entire public utilities, which we have already established. What the closing government does not understand, that is from the debates, from the arguments that have been put forth by the opposition, is that if taxes are already used for particular causes, why is it so unjust to use this one proportion to an immediate cause that will majorly help the situation? The opposition has done absolutely nothing to prove this point. Now, let's take the example of Scandinavian countries in particular, wherein Sweden has a high carbon tax, which is progressive in nature and is proportional to the wealth of its people and its nation, which basically allows them to keep their carbon footprint in check and help further the cause of this entire issue. Now, if we're contributing or donating this amount to a particular independent organization, they will work directly for the cause, which we have already established. Now, moving on to the harms and benefits of this entire case, which has not been covered by any of the teams that have come before us. So we have already established how big corporations are generally to be against this because of their capitalist nature and how they mostly move and work towards their financial gains and don't pay much attention to the environment. So that is one of the biggest harms that can come in this entire case and the main opposition for this. But as I've already established, the benefits of this entire issue easily take up the harms and in fact create an incentive for the corporations themselves to be more environmentally cautious. Now, moving on to some benchwork and some rebuttals. And by the way, my arguments will also be further extended and talked about by my partner. But moving on about the rebuttals and some benchwork, why the closing government is basically better and has done a better job at approaching this case than the opening government is because we have a more comprehensive and more analytical case, and we have provided ample proof and analysis for the same with enough examples for us to provide a different tangent to this entire case. Now, moving on to the opening opposition, to which I have three or four main rebuttals. First of all, the failure of the state is not relevant to this case, especially since we're trying to tax them, which basically means that it is a form of policy in itself, meaning that we are actively working towards it. And it is not just about international organizations, but also local agencies, which will directly tackle the issue at a grassroots level, meaning that we have basically just proved the entire case of the opposition wrong. And we will continue this in our next speech. Thank you very much. Happy to propose.
Right. Thanks a lot for that speech. I now invite member of opposition to open their case. Here.
Panel, my preferred mode of taking POI would be via voice. I'd like if the speakers could unmute in case they want to raise a POI, and I'll then see if I want to take it or not. Having said that, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we're going to be as real and logical as we can be in this debate, because I think this house has been persuaded emotionally, that too on grounds that are immaterial to this motion. I will talk about no Greta Thunberg, who became an internet meme after pictures of the environmentalists using one-time use plastic surface. I'm going to focus on the actual stakeholders in this debate, which no team paid attention to. Having said that, I will structure my speech around extensions, and all rebuttals will be integrated throughout. We at Side Closing Opposition identified 2 core burdens in this debate. That being, number 1 is whether it is legitimate for government to direct taxes to independent organizations, and the second one being whether it is legitimate to expect independent organizations to do better than the government in case of environmental protection. As we seek to answer these questions, we would like to put it forward that environment is a global issue and not limited to a specific spectrum. We see the birth and death of NGOs, and this turnover is a normal process. More often than not, they disappear because their members were not persistent enough in what they were doing, or they got dragged into another field of work, and such movements are not something which are unusual. Now, let me exemplify this for the House. Consider 2 scenarios. One, in which I am the environmental minister of the government who's tasked with working for the betterment of the environment and allied work in the country. The second scenario is I am a driven individual who cares about the environment and decides to start an NGO. As a minister, I have an entire ministry and civil servants to help, assist, and guide me, and also hold me accountable for my actions. But as someone who runs an NGO, I'm not answerable to anyone. I'll say I'm doing everything just fine. I'm using the money that the government gives me from their share of taxes. I'm not getting involved in any laundering activity, and everything is just fine. But then what is the impact and scalability of what I'm doing? Can I compete with the impact and change that the government can bring? No, because I don't have the kind of expertise, workforce, and resources required to do so. Can people associated with me decide to leave in search of better opportunities? Yes, they can, and I won't be able to stop them. Can, owing to some circumstances, I myself decide to give up this mission that I embark on? Yes, I can, and there would be no accountability on my head. Now, the government might say, oh, the motion caters to prominent organizations. But even if someone heading a prominent organization and being associated for a cause for such a long time decides to leave, we'll end up being at the same point. The crux then lies in the fact that these organizations do not have the kind of impact and accountability that a government would instead. We've seen prominent organizations who have credible records also dwindle in the past to then contend a case on this very assumption that these organizations would function perfectly well in the government's paradigm is a far-fetched thing to do. The government on their own decided that the opposition would come and mechanize a case on how a tax would be a burden on the vulnerable groups panel. The opposition very, very well realizes that taking a proportion away from already collected tax does not burden any stakeholder in this debate. But what the government fails to account for is how these independent governmental organizations will make sure that this tax is disbursed to them and does not get wasted or misused. Panel, there is a lot of heterogeneity in why people get engaged in NGOs. However, whatever their motivation is, when people cannot get that sense of belonging to a community and do not have their contribution appreciated, so they give up and quit. The real issue is the indifference of the majority of the population. Everyone talks about the necessity to control authorities, but nobody is eager to spend their own time and money to take care of it. And let's be very clear on that. Even if I consider that we give it to government and they start paying a proportion of taxes to prominent independent environmental organizations, now this would put these organizations under public scrutiny because taxpayers would now want to know how their money is being utilized. The government doesn't tell us how in their paradigm, if people feel that this policy of theirs is a public failure and they fail to understand how how their money is being utilized, what will the government do? Are they going to give up on this policy altogether or make these organizations accountable for an important state function, which is to provide their citizens a healthy environment to live in? We don't know, because this largely remains unaddressed in their side of the house. Now we tell you in our side, the government will use this money and engage in resources in the best possible way. As legitimate governments, we can engage at a global level, embark on agreements and conferences, and bring more to the table, something that is missing in the government's paradigm. The example of government that the government bench conveniently mentioned, now let me shed some more light on that. Throughout the example of Greenpeace that the government mentioned, I would like to shed some more light on that. Now, throughout its history, the policies and objectives of Greenpeace have been criticized by a number of groups, ranging from national governments to members of the industry and even former employees or scientists and political groups that were associated with them. Greenpeace is a hierarchical and undemocratic organization which allows very little control to its members over the campaigns that the organization embarks upon. They have a very strict bureaucratic and borderline authoritarian internal structure where a small group of individuals have control over the organization in both international and local levels. The local action groups are totally dependent on the central body, and the rank and file are excluded from most of their decisions. And can we then hold them accountable for anything? No, because they, as a distinct entity, have their own way of functioning. And this was the best case scenario on the Gov side, which we've totally destroyed, because the future and functioning of such organizations is dicey, and we cannot let such an important issue be dealt with on contingent basis. There have been issues in the past involving organizations such as Greenpeace, where they bet money on fixed rate currency exchange when the euro was gaining against the foreign currency. The government is clearly sleeping in this debate, because they go on to talk about how the opposition is looking at a utopian scenario. No, panel, the scenario in our paradigm is very practical. There are no checks and balances on what organizations like these would do. And in situations where they do indulge in misuse of money, who would be held accountable? Nobody. And this would lead to a wastage of resources and misutilization of hard-earned stakeholder money. The basis of the government that they'll distribute money to varied organizations. Then let me make it very clear as to why this is the worst idea to embark upon. At this point, we were considering very prominent organizations. Now, I'll suppose that number was maybe 10. If this number is diversified even more to say 100, it becomes all the more difficult to keep a track on cases of money laundering. Now they talk about how people would have a protective attitude towards money and then care more for the environment, and this would solve the climate issues in the world, right? Well, panel, liquor is one of the highly taxed goods, yet people consume it. So I fail to understand what case scenario are they talking about. Environmental issues arise at macro levels, and no Tata or Ambani or conglomerate cares about us giving aside a part of the taxes to these particular organizations. So this argument laid down by the government stands refuted. The tax money must be utilized by the government itself to achieve the ends which are desired by the citizenry. The government could be made more accountable, made to diversify the resources in various domains, and that is the way to go forward. The state pouring money into the independent organizations for a crucial task for survival instead of managing itself would be a violation of the promise.
You've exceeded your time limit.
I'm just wrapping up. It would be a violation of the promise that we made to our citizens. In the long run, these private organizations would then become very complacent, because these organizations will be sure of the input of money and would hence lose their agenda. And therefore, we are very proud to oppose this motion.
Thanks a lot for that speech. Just pointing it out to the House again, we stopped writing after 7 minutes 20 seconds. So everything I said after that is not really like covered on the sheets. But anyway, I now invite Government Whip to conclude their case here.
Just give me 10 seconds. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Greetings, House. This is Rishika. I'll be going as the government whip. My preferred pronouns are she and her. And I'll take the POI through via chat. Just write POI and I'll accept it, and then you can ask away. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Well,
I would like to first of all bring the notice of the House to what the both opposition houses have been trying to say. Both the opening opposition and the closing opposition has just been talking about what all could go wrong with these prominent independent organization, which I might emphasize here is only a case scenario. They do not have proof that these things will actually go wrong, and they have actually nowhere clarified clarify what clear solutions that they want in the policies. What do they want? They want to change policies, but they do not want to change policies that the government is trying, because we are trying to change the policy by giving away a proportion of the tax, not the whole tax. The government can still make policies and the government can still work. We are giving away just a proportion of the tax. The opposition needs to understand this, that we are not giving away all the tax. We are not stopping the government from doing anything, state from doing anything. We are just providing an alternative scenario that ensures that some work is being done at all costs. Also, the opposition have provided no framework, absolutely no solution for it. They have only claimed that international organizations won't do a good job with zero proof for it. They talk about accountability. They talk about who will be accountable. Well, in these scenarios, they forget that these are prominent organizations. An organization, independent organization, gets prominent after they achieve a particular level of influence, and at that level of influence, if these people are obviously held accountable, they cannot get away with anything they do. They are not allowed to do anything. Also, they raise questions like taxpayers would want to know how the organizations are working. Well, first of all, these are independent organizations, non-governmental. This means people can get included in them, people can work for these things. And second of all, since these are, again, the point I would like to emphasize, since these are prominent, these are independent, the information is available for the public. Thus, the public can come up and question. These are independent organizations. This is the advantage of these kinds of information organization, that public can question. Thereby, the citizens and the state are both being held responsible and are both being held aware in a situation where they can take decisions for the environmental change. Also, the closing opposition comes up and tell me that what if the heads of these organizations leave, and then when they get a better opportunity? Yes, they can leave. This is an organization. The opposition needs to understand that an organization works in a manner where people are allowed to leave and enter. But since it is an organization, it will continue its work because it is a established thing. It will continue for its goal. It will not stop working. So the money actually, the money that is being given to these organization will be put to good use. Next, I would like to point out that the opening opposition and the closing opposition have been going on and on about that how the government should work for these things. Well, they have given no account to what the closing government and things the government has been trying to tell you, that there is corruption, that governments are struggling for environmental laws. You need to understand this. And also, these governments are in favor of those major corporations who are major contributors to the carbon footprints. So if the government actually supports those corporations too, how does the opposition ensure that that the government will come up and do certain big things for the environmental change? Again, I would like to emphasize here that the closing government does not say that the government has no opportunity to do anything. We are only asking for a proportion of the tax. Also, yeah, I'll take the POI first.
Thank you. Yeah. Prominence is based on popularity and capital. If you control that, then you have leverage over their actions. And how will they be responsible and accountable?
The organizations are independent. While focusing on the prominent part, you did forget the independent organizations. These organizations are independent. They have the right to take their own decisions. When they get a particular amount of influence, these organizations are independent, not governmental. They do not get involved in politics, and it includes common public. The opposition forgets that these organizations are independent. These are people only who are working for the other people themselves. What the closing government is trying to tell here is that these these people, these independent environmental organizations just require a proportion of tax to work for something that the whole public wants, and these are people themselves. Also, I would like to point it out here that the government is also going on and on about that the state should work on their own. I would also like to point it out here that the state is working, the state is donating. The motion is saying clearly that the state is donating the proportion of the tax. So the government, the state is also doing its thing, but when it comes to the state to making governmental laws, there are a lot of struggles and disruptions. But this the state can do easily because they do not have to take major decisions in it. They just need to donate a proportion of tax for a particular thing. The next point I would like to mention is that the opening government has also failed to justify that the people and state are both held equally responsible in this scenario, that both people are aware of what the problems in the world are and what is happening and what needs to be done, and they have a future reference that these are the problems in front of us and we need to work for it. Whereas the state, by donating, is also aware. The state does not need to take big decisions as the opposition is trying to point out again and again, because those decisions are basically these debates have been going on for historical times. Has there been ever any progress? So the whole point of opposition, that government should do this, government should do this, it falls flat and baseless. What the government can do is the best case scenario that the closing opposition is putting forward to you. They can donate a proportion of tax so that these independent prominent organizations who can be held responsible, I would like to emphasize it again, they can be held responsible, could come up with solutions that the people that can be acceptable by everybody. Also, these organizations also provide a safety net, as the opposition is saying that these will not work properly and they will get politicized and everything, but they do provide a safety net, because these are organizations that have been formed for a particular purpose. They will work to attain their goal, they will do some work, so they will eventually help in up leveling the environmental situations. Also, the opposition has also pointed out again that the opening opposition pointed out that they are not bound to answer as they are independent, but they also come and say that they can be politicized and they can be influenced, thereby contradicting their case only. So I would say that their whole case falls flat. Also, the opposition points out that their reach will be less. No, you can continuously forget the point prominent. Their reach will not be less, and in some scenarios it would be more. Thank you, and happy to propose.
Thanks a lot for that speech. I finally invite opposition whip to conclude this debate. Here.
Respected panel, I request just 30 seconds before I begin my speech.
Yeah.
Right. Thanking this house for its patience. But before I begin, once again, POIs through the chat. I will do my very best to address them. Yeah. All that being said, I shall be beginning in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel. Throughout the course of this debate, there are a few primary clashes that have arisen, which is first and foremost about the question of legitimacy when it comes to state funds being disbursed by being employed by an independent organization. The second one being that whether these organizations will be the most effective in their course of operations in addressing this. And finally, a secondary clash, which was basically about the question of relief mechanisms and whether they are whether it's legitimate for opposition to challenge government's case on relief mechanism grounds, right? Like, so for those purposes, right, I'll be addressing like all speakers of the house, which will be interwoven in me dealing with reconciling with these clashes, right? Like, first and foremost, when it comes to the question of legitimacy of this operation, right? Like, what exactly is the social contract that on the basis of which these countries operate? These countries operate on the basis of being bound to the tax-paying citizenry, in exchange for which they will provide them the fullest promise of survival, right? That is the bare essence of the social contract, that like at the very least you will survive, right? And we will do our best to make you survive, right? Like, but what exactly does the government then contend is that these governments are rife with inherent regulatory gaps and corruption, due to which they are not the effective answer to this. But however, they fail to reconcile why exactly it is legitimate for the government to put forth on the basis of on ethical grounds to put forth their donation tax paying money to these organizations, right? Like, what exact to that, and they just tell you that they just tell you the effectiveness, harms and benefits analysis, right? What they fail to understand is that, like, what do taxpayers as a stakeholder want at the core, at its core, right? They want consequences for they want at the very least the illusion of consequences in exchange for the taxes that they pay, right? Like, that should be a belief that there exists a way for to hold to hold the government accountable, right? But when the government defers the responsibility of a state subject that is so crucial to state function and the very bare animal survival of taxpayers at large, it becomes very clear that like closing off takes a win on the question of legitimacy, because neither halves of the government neither halves of the government succeeded in providing you the ethical grounds on the basis of which the government is justifying this action, right? But when we talk about the effectiveness case, right, like, what exactly do we tell you here? We tell you that we do not want a non-governmental organization or any private entity, society for that matter, right, to take on state money and pretend that it will be effective in its course, right? Why is that? Because we present you the like example of BSNL as a co-private co-public entity that works on tax money but acts as a private player, right? What happens then? Like, when you give them money without accountability, when you give them power without accountability, right, they become complacent in their course of work, right? Like, why is this so? Because they can just sit in their seat and eat up the money and misrepresent facts that are like, by the way, the closing government tried to squirrel around the question of transparency by saying that, what, they post all the facts on the internet, etc. Any citizen can look it up, right? Like, even if we do concede that, sure, they can post it over there, they do not explain why these facts won't be misrepresented. And if they when they come up here and tell us that, what, the government can also misrepresent, etc., we tell you that there exists way deeper, way more entrenched mechanisms to deal with such misrepresentations, right? So on that end, we challenge the effectiveness case of their on their side of the house as a whole, because we tell you that when there is a constant inflow of money in the form of donations that comes to these organizations become dormant, right? There is no urgency in their work, because they know that the next donation will just come, because taxes aren't going anywhere, right? Whereas if they weren't rewarded by tax money donations, what would be our counterfactual then these organizations would be reliant on no one but themselves to just straight up do work and reap the benefit of this work, right? But instead they are being unduly rewarded by the government for just building up prominence, right? And what do the how then we put forth a small like argument against the effectiveness by also talking about how these organizations aren't structured in a stable manner, right? And what does closing government do to rebut that? They tell you that, fine, even if their leaders change, etc., it doesn't affect the effectiveness, because that is just natural in the course of NGOs, right? But that is not the case, right? Like, why exactly do governments have such long and entrenched procedures for change of leadership and other such things? Because there is a clear impact on the effectiveness effectiveness and vision of a body and the stakes for this body are extremely high when the tax-paying citizenry has a direct stake in the functionality of this, right? So we can't just brush it under the rug as, oh, this is the bound to happen, like hota hi hai, right? Then finally we talk about, like, about this, like, a concept of, like, there's lack of self-interest in these situations, right? Like, and we will interweave this with the utopian idea of, like, what these organizations look like when the closing government talks about this concept of, like, a big corporate lobbies exercise can wrestle their influence over governments, right? Like, what do we how do we reconcile with that? We tell you that these organizations will not exclusively make money from just tax-paying donations, right? Like, that is not the framework which the motion provides, right? Like, these organizations will make their own money from other ways as well, right? And in those situations, it is completely unjust for them to assume that big corporations won't try to wrestle power over these independent organizations, right? And why is that even worse in for their paradigm than it is on ours, when these corporations can lobby up and force corruption in governments, right? Because as we have, like, despite the fact that it may take time and other such things, right? Like, there still exists the core belief that there can be consequence for corruption when the government partakes in corruption, right? But what does happen when what happens when, like, what do you say, the independent organizations are corrupted by the money flowing in from big organizations? They are not accountable to the tax-paying citizenry from whom they are also charging operational money, etc., right? They are not accountable to these organizations, and the government will then again remain dormant in the approach, because these private players can still directly pay these what do you say, these private organizations. The government will also have the excuse that we do not possess the right to oversee their actions, right? And we categorically reject their claim that we must this the weak claim made by CG, that we must provide a framework for our counter model, etc., because this is a believes that motion, and believes that motion frameworking for counter models, etc., is not relevant. And for those reasons, we are so proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot for this speech, and thanks a lot for this debate. I thank all the participants and congratulate all of them for making it to the Novice finals.